When Nalnish Begay collapsed on Hannah Rose Fletcher's doorstep in the bitter winter of 1882, clutching his starving infant son, she had no idea that her decision to help would transform a dying child into the family she thought she'd lost forever. But to understand why Hannah opened her door to a desperate Navajo brave when every other settler would have turned him away, we must journey back to the autumn that shattered her world and left her questioning everything she believed about survival, love, and the true meaning of family.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The October wind howled through the Colorado Territory like a banshee, carrying with it the promise of an early and brutal winter. Hannah Rose Fletcher stood at the kitchen window of her ranch house, watching the golden aspens bend and sway in the distance, their leaves falling like tears against the darkening sky. At 32, she had learned that the frontier was merciless in its ability to strip away everything you thought was permanent, leaving behind only the raw bones of survival and the hollow echo of what once was. 6 months had passed since the accident that claimed her husband Thomas and their 8-year-old son Michael. The memory still felt like a fresh wound, raw and bleeding in the cold mountain air. They had been returning from town with supplies when their wagon hit a patch of mud made treacherous by spring rains. The wagon had overturned, pinning Thomas beneath its weight while Michael was thrown into the swollen creek. Hannah had survived with only bruises and a broken heart that would never fully heal. She had managed to pull herself from the wreckage, but by the time she reached Thomas, his breathing had already grown shallow, and Michael's small body had been swept downstream by the merciless current the people of Cedar Falls had expected her to sell the ranch and move back east, to return to the civilized world where proper ladies didn't try to work cattle ranches alone. But Hannah had something burning inside her that refused to surrender. This land held every memory of her family, every dream they had shared, every moment of joy that had made the hardships worthwhile. She would not abandon the place where Thomas had built their home with his own hands, where Michael had taken his first steps, where they had planned to grow old together, watching their children and grandchildren carry on their legacy. The ranch itself sprawled across 300 acres of prime grazing land, nestled in a valley between towering peaks that turned purple in the evening light. Thomas had chosen the location well, with access to fresh water from a mountain stream and natural windbreaks that protected the livestock during the harsh winter months. The main house was solid timber construction, built to last through generations, with a wide front porch that faced the sunrise and a kitchen garden that Hannah had lovingly tended for nearly a decade. The barn could house 50 head of cattle, and the corrals were strong enough to withstand the most determined Mustang. But running a ranch alone was like trying to hold back the tide with bare hands. Hannah had managed to keep 30 head of cattle through the summer, but she knew the approaching winter would test every skill she had learned in her years as a rancher's wife. The physical demands were relentless, feeding livestock before dawn, mending fences that seemed to break with every windstorm, hauling water when the pipes froze, and doctoring sick animals with remedies Thomas had taught her. Her hands, once soft and ladylike, had become calloused and scarred from rope burns and barbed wire. Her back ached constantly from lifting hay bales and wrestling with stubborn cattle. But the emotional toll was far worse than any physical hardship. As autumn deepened into the promise of winter, Hannah found herself clinging to routines that had once brought her comfort, but now felt like hollow rituals. Every morning she would wake before sunrise and make coffee for two, only to remember that Thomas would never again sit across from her at the kitchen table, sharing plans for the day ahead. She would set the table for three, automatically placing Michael's favorite blue plate beside her own, then have to put it away with tears streaming down her face. The silence in the house had become oppressive, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock Thomas had brought from their honeymoon in Denver and the occasional creak of settling timber The neighboring ranchers had been kind in their own way, but Hannah could sense their doubt about her ability to survive on her own. Jake Morrison from the adjoining spread had offered to buy her out at a fair price, promising to keep Thomas's memory alive by maintaining the property well. "It's not that I don't think you're capable, Hannah," he had said, hat in hand and eyes full of sympathy. "But winter's coming, and this country doesn't forgive mistakes. You've got nothing to prove to anyone." But Hannah knew she had everything to prove, if only to herself. She had to know that she could honor Thomas and Michael's memory by keeping alive the dream they had built together. The cattle were her constant companions now, and she had learned to read their moods and needs with an intuition that surprised even herself. The old bull, Caesar, had initially challenged her authority, but Hannah had faced him down with a determination that earned his grudging respect. The pregnant cows required extra attention as they prepared for spring calving, and Hannah spent hours checking on them, ensuring they had adequate shelter and nutrition. She had learned to deliver calves by herself, staying up through cold nights to assist difficult births, her hands gentle but firm as she guided new life into the world. November brought the first serious snowfall, and with it, a crystalline beauty that took Hannah's breath away, even as it filled her with dread. The mountains transformed into towering monuments of white and silver, their peaks sharp against the pearl-gray sky. The aspen groves stood bare and ghostly, their white bark stark against the deep green of the pines. It was the kind of beauty that made her understand why Thomas had fallen in love with this land, why he had been willing to risk everything to build a life here. But beauty on the frontier was often accompanied by danger, and Hannah knew that the same snow that created such stunning vistas could also become a trap that claimed lives with swift and merciless efficiency. The work became harder with each passing day. Ice formed on the water troughs, requiring her to break it with an axe every morning and evening. The cattle needed more hay to maintain their body heat, and Hannah found herself making multiple trips to the barn, her arms aching from the weight of the bales. The chickens huddled in their coop, producing fewer eggs as the daylight hours shortened. Hannah's vegetable garden lay dormant under a blanket of snow, and she was grateful for the vegetables she had canned during the summer months, though she worried whether her supplies would last through the winter. It was during one of these early snowstorms that Hannah first encountered the Navajo people, who would change her life forever. She had been in the barn, checking on a cow that had seemed listless the day before, when she heard the sound of horses approaching. Peering through the barn door, she saw a small group of riders moving slowly across her property. They were clearly Native Americans, though at that distance she couldn't determine their tribe. Hannah's first instinct was fear, born from years of frontier stories about raids and conflicts. But as she watched them, she noticed they were traveling with women and children, and their pace was that of people seeking shelter, not war. Group camped in the shelter of a grove of pines about a quarter-mile from her house, close enough that she could see the glow of their campfire, but far enough to respect the boundaries of her property. Hannah spent that night watching from her window, torn between curiosity and caution. She had heard stories from other ranchers about Navajo families who had been displaced from their traditional lands, forced to wander in search of food and shelter. The federal government's policies had been harsh and often brutal, and Hannah knew that many Native families were struggling to survive in an increasingly hostile world. The next morning, Hannah was surprised to find a young Navajo woman standing at her kitchen door, holding a small bundle of furs. The woman was perhaps 25, with intelligent dark eyes and an expression that mixed hope with resignation. She spoke no English, but her gestures were clear. She wanted to trade the furs for food. Hannah's heart went out to her, recognizing the universal language of a mother trying to provide for her family. Despite her own limited supplies, Hannah filled a sack with beans, flour, and jerky, refusing to take the furs in return. The woman's gratitude was evident, and she tried to
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Communicate something more complex, gesturing toward the camp and then toward Hannah's house. Hannah understood that she was being invited to visit, an invitation that filled her with both curiosity and trepidation. That afternoon, she made her way to the camp, carrying a pot of soup she had prepared with vegetables from her cellar. What she found there challenged every assumption she had been taught about Native Americans. The camp was organized and clean, with families grouped around individual fires. Children played quietly while women worked on various tasks, mending clothes, preparing food, crafting tools. The men sat in a circle, speaking in low voices about matters that seemed weighty and important. Hannah was welcomed with a courtesy that surprised her, and though communication was limited, she found herself drawn into their community through gestures, smiles, and the universal language of shared humanity. It was here that she first met Nalnish Bege, though she wouldn't learn his name until much later. He was a man of perhaps 30, with the bearing of a natural leader and eyes that seemed to hold both great wisdom and deep sadness. He was clearly respected by the others, and Hannah noticed that people sought his counsel on various matters. When he looked at her, she felt no threat, only a recognition that passed between two people who had known loss and were trying to find their way forward. Over the following weeks, as the weather grew colder and snow began to fall more frequently, Hannah found herself visiting the camp regularly. She learned that this was a family group that had been wandering for months, seeking a place where they could settle and rebuild their lives. They had lost their traditional homeland through government policy she didn't fully understand, but the effects were clear. They were displaced, hungry, and facing an uncertain future. The language barrier slowly began to break down as Hannah learned basic Navajo words, and the camp's members picked up English phrases. She discovered that Nalnish was not just a leader, but also a healer, someone who understood both traditional medicine and the practical needs of survival. He had been trying to lead his people to safety, but the harsh realities of frontier life had made their journey increasingly desperate. Hannah began to understand that this group was not so different from the white settlers who had come west, seeking new opportunities. They were families trying to survive, parents hoping to provide for their children, people with dreams and fears and hopes that transcended the boundaries of culture and race. The realization challenged everything she had been taught about the divisions between Native Americans and settlers, and she found herself questioning the assumptions that had shaped her worldview. As winter deepened, Hannah could see that the camp was struggling. The children were thinner, the adults more worried, and the daily search for food was becoming increasingly difficult. The game in the area was scarce, and the traditional foods they knew how to find were not available in this region. Hannah began sharing more of her supplies, but she knew that her own resources were limited and that the arrangement couldn't continue indefinitely. It was during one of these visits that she learned about Nalnish's personal tragedy. Through a mixture of broken English and gestures, she understood that he had recently lost his wife in childbirth, leaving him alone with an infant son. The baby was struggling without his mother's milk, and despite the care of the camp's women, he was growing weaker each day. Hannah's heart broke for the young father, seeing in his eyes the same devastation she had felt when she lost her own family. The parallels between their situations were impossible to ignore. Both had lost their spouses, both were struggling to survive in a harsh environment, and both were facing the prospect of a winter that could claim even more lives. Hannah began to realize that fate had brought them together for a reason. Though she couldn't yet understand what that reason might be, the blizzard that would change Hannah's life forever began on a December night when the temperature dropped so suddenly that the water in her wash basin turned to ice. The wind howled like a living thing, driving snow horizontally across the landscape and making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Hannah huddled in her kitchen, feeding wood to the stove and listening to the house creak. and grown under the storm's assault, she worried about her cattle, knowing that they would cluster together in the barn and the natural windbreaks, but also understanding that storms like this had claimed entire herds in the past. She worried about her neighbors scattered across the valley in isolated homesteads, where help might be hours or days away. But most of all, she worried about the Navajo camp, exposed to the full fury of the storm with only canvas and hide shelters for protection. The blizzard raged for 3 days, and when it finally passed, Hannah emerged to find a world transformed. Snow had drifted against her house to the level of the windows, and the familiar landscape had been sculpted into alien forms by the relentless wind. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional crack of a tree branch overburdened with snow. Hannah knew that this storm would be remembered as one of the worst in memory, and she feared what she might find when she finally managed to make her way to the camp. What she discovered there would test every belief she held about duty, compassion, and the true meaning of family. The storm had scattered the camp, and several families were missing. The survivors were gathered in a makeshift shelter, their faces drawn with cold and hunger. But it was the sight of Nalnish Begay, clutching his starving infant son, that would haunt her dreams and ultimately change the course of her life. The baby was dying, and everyone knew it. Despite the best efforts of the camp's women, the infant hadn't been able to take enough nourishment to survive the harsh conditions. Nalnish's face was a mask of grief and desperation, and Hannah could see that he was facing every parent's worst nightmare. In that moment, looking at the dying child and his broken father, Hannah Rose Fletcher made a decision that would echo through generations and prove that sometimes the most important families are the ones we choose to create. Hannah Rose Fletcher was awakened not by sound, but by silence. The kind of profound, unsettling quiet that follows a storm so violent it seems to have swept away the very essence of life itself. She lay in her bed, wrapped in Thomas's old wool blankets, listening to the strange absence of wind that had howled for 3 days straight. The house felt different somehow, as if the storm had shifted its very foundation. And Hannah knew with the intuition of someone who had lived through many frontier winters that this night would bring challenges unlike any she had faced before. Rising from her bed, Hannah padded to the window in her bare feet, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight in the pre-dawn darkness. What she saw outside took her breath away. The world had been transformed into something alien and beautiful, with snow drifted so high against the barn that only the peak of its roof was visible. The familiar landmarks of her ranch had been erased, replaced by smooth, undulating hills of white that reflected the pale moonlight like a sea of silver. It was beautiful, but Hannah knew that such beauty on the frontier often came with a price measured in lives. The sound, when it came, was so faint that at first Hannah thought she had imagined it. A rhythmic thumping, weak and irregular, like someone trying to knock but lacking the strength to make a proper sound. Hannah stood perfectly still, straining her ears, wondering if it was merely the house settling or perhaps a tree branch blown against the walls. But then it came again, more insistent now, and Hannah realized with a shock that someone was at her door, moving quickly through the dark house. Hannah grabbed Thomas's rifle from above the mantel, her hands trembling not from cold but from the sudden awareness that anyone traveling on a night like this must be either desperate or dangerous. She had learned to be cautious in her months alone, understanding that a woman without male protection was vulnerable to all manner of threats. The frontier attracted good people seeking new opportunities, but it also drew those who preyed on the weak and isolated. Hannah approached the door with the weapon ready, her heart pounding as she called out into the darkness, "Who's there? What do you want?" Her voice carried the authority she had learned to project when dealing with difficult cattle or aggressive predators, but she could hear the tremor of fear beneath the words. The response came in a voice so weak she had to strain to hear it, speaking in accented English that was barely above a whisper. "Please, Senora, help. My son, he is dying. I have nowhere else to go." The words hit Hannah like a physical blow, and she found herself moving toward the door before her mind had fully processed what she was doing. Through the small window beside the door, Hannah could see a figure slumped against her porch railing. And what she saw there challenged every assumption she had made about the source of the knocking. The man was clearly Native American, his long black hair hanging loose around his shoulders, his clothes a mixture of traditional garments and pieces of white man's clothing that spoke of a life caught between two worlds. But it was what he held in his arms that made Hannah's breath catch in her throat, a small bundle wrapped in what appeared to be a rabbit fur blanket, so still that she feared the worst had already happened. Hannah's first instinct was the one every frontier woman had been taught from childhood: bar the door, stay inside, wait for danger to pass. The stories were legend throughout the territory, tales of raids and violence that had shaped the relationship between settlers and Native Americans for generations. But as Hannah studied the figure on her porch, she saw something that transcended all the warnings and fears she had been taught. This was not a warrior come to bring violence, but a father holding his dying child, and the desperation in his posture spoke a language that needed no translation. Opening the door slowly, Hannah stepped onto the porch with the rifle still in her hands, though she held it loosely now, more from habit than any real sense of threat. The man looked up at her with eyes that held a mixture of hope and resignation, as if he expected rejection, but had no other options left to pursue. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with the bearing of someone who had known leadership and responsibility. His clothes were damp with melted snow, and she could see that he was shivering despite his obvious efforts to remain composed. "Please," he said again, his voice breaking slightly on the word. "My son, he needs milk. His mother, she died when he was born. The women in my camp, they try to help, but they have no milk to give. He grows weaker each day, and now." He gestured toward the bundle in his arms, and Hannah could see tears freezing on his cheeks. "I have been to every house in the valley. They turned me away with guns and threats. You are my last hope before I must watch him die." The simple honesty of his words cut through Hannah's defenses like a blade, and she found herself looking not at a stranger to be feared, but at a parent facing every mother's worst nightmare. Hannah set the rifle aside and stepped closer, her eyes focusing on the bundle in the man's arms. "May I see him?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had experience with children and animals alike. The man hesitated for just a moment, then carefully pulled back the edge of the blanket to reveal a tiny face, pale and still, with the unmistakable signs of malnutrition that Hannah had learned to recognize during her years on the frontier. The baby's breathing was shallow and irregular, and Hannah could see that without immediate intervention, the child would not survive another day. "What's his name?" Hannah asked, her practical nature taking over as she assessed the situation. The man looked surprised by the question, as if he hadn't expected anyone to care about such details. "Yiska," he replied, the name carrying a musical quality that seemed to warm the cold air between them. "It means the night has passed in our language. I chose it because he was born at dawn, after a long and difficult night." Hannah felt her heart clench at the beauty of the name and the hope it represented. Hope that now seemed to be slipping away with each shallow breath the infant took. "I'm Hannah," she said, making a decision that would change all their lives. Hannah rose. "Fletcher, and you are?" The man straightened slightly, and Hannah caught a glimpse of the dignity that had carried him through what must have been days of rejection and humiliation. "I am Nalnish Bagay," he said, his voice carrying a formality that spoke of respect and gratitude. "In your language, my name means he works. I am of the Dine people, what you call Navajo. I have come far from my homeland, seeking safety for my family." Hannah nodded. understanding that this simple exchange of names had created a bridge between their worlds. Nalnish, Hannah repeated, testing the unfamiliar syllables on her tongue. How long has it been since Yiska last ate? The question was practical, born from her experience helping with difficult births and caring for orphaned calves. Nalnish's face darkened with shame and desperation. 2 days, maybe 3. The storm scattered our camp, and we lost most of our supplies. The women have been trying to feed him with broths and teas, but he cannot take enough to survive. He needs milk, and we have none to give. Hannah could hear the exhaustion in his voice, the weight of days spent watching his child slowly fade away. Hannah looked at the dying infant and felt something stir within her that had been dormant since she lost her own family. It was a fierce protective instinct that had no regard for racial boundaries or social conventions, only for the fundamental truth that a child's life hung in the balance. Bring him inside, she said, stepping back to allow Nalnish to enter her home. It's too cold out here, and if we're going to help him, we need to get him warm first. Nalnish hesitated at the threshold, clearly understanding the magnitude of trust such an invitation represented. You would do this? He asked, his voice filled with wonder and disbelief. You would help the child of a stranger, someone your people see as an enemy? Hannah met his gaze steadily, seeing in his eyes the same desperation she had felt when she lost her own family, the same fierce love that would drive a parent to risk everything for their child's survival. I see a father who loves his son, she said simply. That's all I need to see. With those words, she stepped aside and gestured for him to enter, knowing that this moment would divide her life into before and after. The warmth of the house seemed to revive Yiska slightly, and Hannah could hear a weak cry escape from the bundle in Nalnish's arms. It was a sound that spoke of life still fighting against the darkness, and Hannah felt a surge of determination that surprised her with its intensity. She had failed to save her own family, but perhaps she could save this one. Sit by the fire, she instructed, moving quickly to stoke the flames and add more wood. We need to warm him gradually, and then we'll see what we can do about getting him fed. Nalnish settled into the chair nearest the fireplace, cradling his son with a tenderness that made Hannah's heart ache. As the infant warmed, his cries grew stronger, and Hannah found herself remembering the techniques she had learned from the women of Cedar Falls for dealing with orphaned animals. She had successfully raised calves whose mothers had died in childbirth, and while a human baby was far more delicate, the basic principles were the same. I have some cow's milk, she said, moving toward the kitchen. It's not ideal, but if we warm it and thin it properly, it might help. Nalnish watched her with eyes that held a mixture of hope and fear. Understanding that this woman represented his son's last chance for survival, Hannah worked quickly, warming the milk to body temperature and mixing it with water to make it more digestible for the infant's delicate system. She found a clean cloth and fashioned it into a makeshift nursing device, remembering techniques she had learned from the midwives who had helped during difficult births in the community. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her mind was racing with the implications of what she was doing. She was not just feeding a hungry child. She was crossing boundaries that had been drawn in blood and maintained through generations of conflict. When she returned to the living room, she found Nalnish speaking softly to his son in the musical language of his people. The words were incomprehensible to Hannah, but their meaning was universal. A father's love, a parent's desperation, the timeless litany of promises that adults make to children they may not be able to protect. Hannah knelt beside the chair and gently took the baby from his father's arms, feeling the fragility of the tiny body and the faint flutter of a heartbeat that seemed determined to continue despite all odds. Let's try this, Hannah said, guiding the makeshift feeding device toward the infant's mouth. For a moment, nothing happened, and Hannah feared that they were too late. But then Yiska's lips moved slightly, and she could see him beginning to take in the nourishment his body so desperately needed. The relief on Nalnish's face was immediate and profound, and Hannah felt tears spring to her eyes as she watched the father and son who had stumbled into her life on this storm-torn night. The feeding was slow and careful, with Hannah monitoring every sign of the infant's response. Gradually, Yiska's color began to improve, and his breathing became more regular. It was a small victory, but Hannah knew that it was only the beginning. This child would need constant care and attention if he was to survive, and the question of what would happen next loomed large in the warm circle of firelight that surrounded them. Hannah looked at Nalnish, seeing in his eyes a gratitude so deep it seemed to encompass not just this moment, but all the moments that had led to it. "He's going to need more than one feeding," Hannah said gently, stating the obvious truth that they both understood. "He'll need to eat every few hours, and he'll need to be kept warm and clean. Where is your camp now? Are there others who can help care for him?" Nalnish's face darkened with worry, and Hannah could see the weight of leadership that he carried. The responsibility not just for his own son, but for all the people who looked to him for guidance. "The storm scattered us," he admitted. "Some families took shelter in the mountains, others went toward the river. We were to meet again when the weather cleared, but that may be days away, and even then..." He trailed off, but Hannah could fill in the rest. Even then, they would still be a displaced people with limited resources, facing a winter that showed no mercy to anyone, regardless of their race or circumstances. Hannah understood that this was not just about saving one child, but about confronting the larger questions of survival and humanity that the frontier forced upon everyone who dared to make a life there. She looked at the baby in her arms, at the father who had risked everything to save him, and felt the weight of a decision that would define not just their immediate future, but the kind of person she chose to be. "He can stay here," Hannah said, the words coming out before she had fully thought them through. "At least until he's strong enough to travel, and until your people can regroup. I have enough supplies to care for him, and..." She paused, struggling with the implications of what she was offering. "And I have experience with caring for those who need help." Nalnish stared at her, and Hannah could see that he was struggling to process the offer, to understand why a white woman would risk her reputation and safety for a Navajo child. "Why?" he asked simply, the question carrying the weight of centuries of conflict and misunderstanding. Hannah looked down at Yiska, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms for the first time since his arrival, and felt the answer rise from a place deeper than rational thought. "Because I know what it's like to lose a child," she said quietly. "And because I know what it's like to be alone in a world that doesn't seem to care whether you live or die. If I can prevent that from happening to someone else, then maybe..." She couldn't finish the sentence, but Nalnish seemed to understand. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and Hannah could feel the weight of the moment settling around them like a blanket. Outside, the storm had passed, but inside, something new was beginning to take shape. It was fragile and uncertain, built on nothing more than shared humanity and the desperate hope that love could transcend the boundaries that others had drawn. Hannah Rose Fletcher, the widow of Cedar Falls, had made a choice that would echo through generations, proving that sometimes the most important families are the ones we choose to create in the face of impossible odds. The first rays of sunlight, streaming through Hannah's kitchen window, revealed a scene that would have been unimaginable just 24 hours earlier. Nalnish Bege sat at her wooden table, carefully feeding his son with a spoon Hannah had fashioned from a piece of carved wood, while Hannah herself stood at the stove preparing a more substantial meal for the man who had risked everything to save his child. The baby, Yiska, had survived the night and was showing encouraging signs of recovery, his skin no longer the frightening gray color that had marked him as near death. But Hannah knew that one night of proper care was only the beginning of what would be required to restore the infant to full health. The silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward, born from the shared understanding that they had witnessed something profound in the hours of darkness that had just passed. Hannah had spent much of the night awake, taking turns with Nalnish to feed the baby every 2 hours, and in those quiet moments between feedings, she had begun to see glimpses of the man behind the desperate father who had appeared at her door. He was intelligent and thoughtful, with a quiet dignity that spoke of natural leadership and deep spiritual grounding. More importantly, she had seen the gentle patience with which he cared for his son, the way he spoke to the infant in soft tones that needed no translation. "The sun brings hope," Nalnish said quietly, his English careful but clear as he watched. The golden light spread across the snowy landscape beyond the window. "In our tradition, we greet each dawn with gratitude, for it means we have been given another day to walk in beauty. Today, because of your kindness, my son will see many more sunrises." Hannah felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, understanding that this was more than simple gratitude, but a recognition of the sacred nature of what had transpired between them. Hannah placed a bowl of warm oatmeal and dried berries in front of Nalnish, along with fresh bread she had baked. The previous day, she had noticed that he had eaten nothing since his arrival, his entire focus concentrated on his son's needs, and she recognized the self-sacrifice that characterized devoted parents everywhere. "You need to keep your strength up," she said. Gently, "Yiska needs his father to be healthy and strong. You can't care for him properly if you don't care for yourself first." Nalnish looked up at her with surprise, as if the concept of someone caring for his welfare was foreign to his recent experience. As Nalnish ate, Hannah found herself studying his face in the morning light, noting the lines of exhaustion and worry that spoke of weeks or perhaps months of constant stress. She could see that he was probably close to her own age, though the hardships he had endured had aged him beyond his years. There was a strength in his features that suggested he had been a man of importance in his community, someone accustomed to making difficult decisions and bearing responsibility for others. The fact that he had been reduced to begging for help at the doors of strangers spoke to the desperate circumstances that had driven him to her threshold. "Tell me about your people," Hannah said softly, settling into the chair across from him with her own cup of coffee. "Where do you come from? And how did you end up here in Colorado?" Nalnish's eyes took on a distant look, as if he were seeing across vast stretches of time and space to a world that seemed increasingly remote from their current reality. "We are Dean," he began, using the name his people called themselves. "We come from the land of red rocks and endless sky, where the mountains are sacred and the wind carries the voices of our ancestors. For generations beyond counting, our people lived in harmony with that land, raising sheep and corn, weaving beautiful textiles, and following the ancient ways that kept us strong." Hannah listened intently as Nalnish described a way of life that seemed as foreign to her as the surface of the moon. Yet she could hear in his voice the same love of land and family that had driven her own ancestors to seek new opportunities in the West. He spoke of vast territories where his people had roamed freely, of ceremonies that connected them to the natural world, and of a complex social structure that had maintained peace and prosperity for centuries. But then his voice grew heavy with sorrow as he began to describe the changes that had come with the arrival of white settlers and the United States government. "The government men came with papers and promises," Nalnish continued, his hands tightening slightly around his coffee cup. "They said we must move to a new place, a reservation where we would be safe and provided for. But the place they chose was far from our sacred mountains, and the soil was poor for growing crops. Many of our people became sick, and the promised supplies never came. Some groups tried to return to the old country, but the soldiers came after them with guns and threats." Hannah felt a chill run down her spine as she began to understand the scope of the tragedy that had befallen Nalnish's people. The story that emerged was one of bureaucratic cruelty disguised as benevolent policy, of a proud people stripped of their traditional way of life and forced to adapt to circumstances that seemed designed to break their spirit. Nalnish described the long walk, a forced relocation that had claimed thousands of lives, and the years of suffering that followed as his people struggled to survive in an alien environment. He spoke of families torn apart, of children sent to distant schools where they were forbidden to speak their native language, and of a systematic attempt to erase the cultural identity that had sustained the dying for generations. But some of us refused to surrender, Nalnish said, his voice carrying a note of quiet pride. We left the reservation and tried to find places where we could live according to the old ways. We formed small bands, like the one you met, and we have been wandering ever since, seeking a place where we can raise our children in safety and teach them who they are. Hannah began to understand that the group she had encountered was not a war party or a threat to local settlers, but rather a desperate family group trying to preserve their way of life against overwhelming odds. As the morning progressed, Hannah found herself drawn into Nalnish's world through his stories and explanations. He described the intricate relationships between his people and the natural world, the way they read signs in the behavior of animals and the changing of seasons, and the complex spiritual beliefs that guided their daily lives. Hannah was surprised to discover that many of their values aligned with her own: the importance of family, the responsibility to care for those in need, and the belief that true strength came from serving others rather than dominating them. In our tradition, Nalnish explained as he gently rocked his son, children belong not just to their parents, but to the entire community. Every adult has a responsibility to guide and protect every child, because children are the future of our people. When my wife died, I thought I would be alone in raising Yiska, but the women of our group immediately became his grandmothers and aunts. They have shared their knowledge and their love, even though they have so little of everything else to share. Hannah felt a pang of recognition, remembering the way the women of Cedar Falls had rallied around her after Thomas and Michael's deaths. The baby had been sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle Hannah had fashioned from a wooden crate and soft blankets. But as the morning warmed, he began to stir and make the small sounds that indicated he was ready for another feeding. Hannah watched with growing admiration as Nalnish immediately responded to his son's needs, his movements gentle and practiced despite the obvious exhaustion that still marked his features. It was clear that this man had been a devoted father even before tragedy had made him a single parent. May I? Hannah asked, extending her arms toward the baby. Nalnish hesitated for just a moment, then carefully placed his son in her arms, watching closely as she settled the infant against her shoulder. Hannah felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest as she held the small body, remembering the weight and feel of her own son at this age. Yiska seemed to recognize her as someone safe and caring, relaxing into her embrace with a tiny sigh that spoke of trust and contentment. As Hannah fed the baby, she began to share her own story with Nalnish, describing the life she had built with Thomas and the dreams they had shared for their future. She spoke of Michael's laugh, of the way he had loved exploring the mountains and learning about the animals that lived there. She described the accident that had taken them both, and the months of grief and loneliness that had followed. Nalnish listened with the same respectful attention she had given to his stories, and Hannah could see understanding and sympathy in his dark eyes. Loss is the price we pay for love, Nalnish said softly when she had finished. Among our people, we believe that those who die continue to walk with us, that their spirits guide and protect us even when we cannot see them. Perhaps your husband and son brought me to your door, knowing that you would understand what it means to fight for family. Hannah felt tears spring to her eyes at the beautiful simplicity of his words, and she realized that this man had given her a gift more precious than gold, a new way of understanding her own grief. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching, and Hannah looked out the window to see several riders making their way carefully across the snow-covered landscape toward her house. She recognized them as neighbors from the surrounding ranches, and her heart sank as she realized that their peaceful mourning was about to become much more complicated. The men were armed and their expressions were grim, suggesting that word of Nalnish's presence had somehow spread despite the isolated location of her ranch. "Stay calm," Hannah said quietly to Nalnish, who had immediately tensed at the sound of approaching horses. "Let me handle this. These are my neighbors, and while they may not understand what's happening here, they're not bad men." Nalnish nodded, but Hannah could see that he was preparing himself for the worst, his body language shifting subtly as he moved to a position where he could protect his son if necessary. The transformation reminded Hannah that this gentle father was also a warrior, trained to fight when fighting was necessary. Jake Morrison was the first to reach the porch, his face set in lines of concern and determination. Behind him rode Bill Patterson, whose wife had been one of Hannah's closest friends before the accident, and Tom Bradley, a young rancher who had recently arrived from Kansas with his new bride. Hannah stepped onto the porch to meet them, leaving Nalnish and the baby inside, but keeping the door open so they could see that she was unharmed. "Hannah, we heard there was an Indian here," Jake said without preamble, his eyes scanning the area around the house for signs of threat. "Mrs. Chun saw smoke from your chimney all night and figured something was wrong. When she went to investigate this morning, she saw tracks in the snow and got worried about you." Hannah appreciated the concern of her neighbors, but she also understood that their presence represented a potential danger to the man and child she had committed to protecting. "There's no danger, Jake," Hannah said firmly, her voice carrying the authority she had learned to project when dealing with difficult situations. "I have a guest who needed help, and I provided it. That's all you need to know." But Jake's expression remained skeptical, and Hannah could see that he was not going to be satisfied with such a simple explanation. "Hannah, you're a woman alone out here, and you can't be too careful. Indians have been raiding settlements all through the territory, and you don't know what this one might be planning. His name is Nalnish." Hannah interrupted, her voice growing sharper. "He's not an Indian or this one. He's a man with a name and a family, and he came to me seeking help for his dying son. I gave him that help, just as I would for any of you if you came to my door in need." The three men exchanged glances, and Hannah could see that they were struggling to reconcile her words with the assumptions they had brought with them. Bill Patterson, who had known Hannah the longest, dismounted and approached the porch with his hands visible and his expression more open than Jake's. "Hannah, we're not trying to cause trouble, but you have to understand how this looks. A single woman taking in a strange Indian could mean all kinds of problems for you and for the whole community. What if his tribe comes looking for him? What if the authorities find out you're harboring him?" Hannah felt anger rising in her chest, but she also understood that these men were operating from fear and ignorance rather than malice. "What I understand," Hannah said, her voice carrying a steel that surprised even herself, "is that a father brought his dying child to me for help, and I helped him. If that's harboring, then I'm proud to be guilty of it. And if his people come looking for him, they'll find him healthy and safe, which is more than they could say if I had turned him away." The strength in her voice seemed to give the men pause, and Hannah could see them reassessing their assumptions about both her and the situation. Tom Bradley, the youngest of the group, spoke up with the uncertainty of someone still learning the ways of the frontier. "But Hannah, what if he's dangerous? What if he's planning something?" Before Hannah could respond, the door behind her opened, and Nalnish appeared in the doorway, holding his son in his arms. The baby was awake and alert, his small hands grasping at the beaded necklace his father wore, and the sight of the gentle interaction between father and child spoke more eloquently than any words could have. "I am Nalnish Bege of the Dine people," he said, his voice carrying quiet dignity despite the obvious tension of the moment. "I came to this woman's door because my son was dying, and she has saved his life. I mean no harm to her or to any of you. I seek only to care for my child and to find a place where we can live in peace." The simple honesty of his words seemed to diffuse some of the tension, and Hannah could see the men struggling with the disconnect between their expectations and the reality of what they were witnessing. Jake Morrison, who had been the most aggressive in his concerns, found himself looking at a scene that challenged everything he thought he knew about the relationship between white settlers and Native Americans. Here was not a savage warrior planning raids, but a devoted father caring for his infant son with obvious love and tenderness. The baby was clearly thriving under his care, and the man's demeanor suggested someone who was grateful for help rather than planning to take advantage of it. "How long is he planning to stay?" Bill Patterson asked, his tone more curious than accusatory now. Hannah looked at Nalnish, understanding that this question went to the heart of the matter. "Until his son is strong enough to travel, and until his people can regroup after the storm," she replied. "And then they'll move on to wherever they can find safety and peace." The answer seemed to satisfy the men somewhat, but Hannah could see that they were still uncomfortable with the situation. "Hannah, you know we respect your right to make your own decisions," Jake said finally. "But you also have to understand that actions like this could have consequences for all of us. If word gets out that settlers are helping Indians, it could bring all kinds of trouble to the valley." Hannah felt the weight of his words, understanding that her choice to help Nalnish and Yiska had implications that extended far beyond her own property lines. "Then I guess we'll have to hope that the people of this valley are better than their reputation suggests," Hannah replied, her voice carrying both challenge and invitation. "Because I'm not going to turn away a dying child, no matter what the consequences might be. And I hope that when you think about it, you'll realize that you wouldn't want me to." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with the men gradually coming to accept that Hannah had made her choice and was prepared to stand by it. As the neighbors finally rode away, Hannah felt both relief and apprehension about what the future might bring. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and she understood that her relationship with some members of her community might never be the same. But as she looked at Nalnish and his son, she knew that she had made the right choice, even if it proved to be the difficult one. "Thank you," Nalnish said quietly as they watched the riders disappear into the distance. "You risked much to defend us, and I will not forget your courage." Hannah smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. "We're going to be just fine," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself. What she did know was that she had found something she thought she had lost forever, a purpose that extended beyond her own survival and a family that had been forged in the crucible of desperate need and mutual trust. 3 weeks had passed since that storm-torn night when Nalnish Begay had collapsed on Hannah's doorstep, and the Fletcher Ranch had been transformed into something neither of them could have imagined. The baby Yiska had not only survived but was thriving, his cheeks now round with healthy color and his eyes bright with the curiosity of an infant discovering the world around him. Hannah had found herself falling deeper into the role of surrogate mother with each passing day, her heart expanding to accommodate a love she had thought was lost forever when Michael died. But as January's bitter cold settled over the Colorado Territory, she was about to discover that the greatest challenges lay not in caring for a Navajo child, but in defending her right to do so against a community that was beginning to turn against her. The morning that would change everything began with an unexpected visitor, Dr. Samuel Whitmore, the territorial physician who traveled between settlements providing medical care, had arrived unannounced at Hannah's ranch, ostensibly to check on reports of illness in the area. Hannah had met Dr. Whitmore several times over the years, and she had always found him to be a reasonable man with progressive views about frontier medicine. But as she watched him examine Yiska with professional thoroughness, she sensed an underlying tension that had nothing to do with medical concerns. "This child is remarkably healthy," Dr. Whitmore observed as he completed his examination, his voice carrying a note of surprise that Hannah found vaguely insulting. His muscle tone is excellent, his reflexes are normal, and his weight gain suggests he's been receiving exceptional care. Whoever has been caring for him clearly knows what they're doing. Hannah felt a flush of pride at the compliment, but she also noticed that the doctor's eyes kept drifting to Nalnish, who stood quietly in the corner of the room, watching every movement with the protective alertness of a father who had learned not to trust easily. Nalnish has been an excellent father, Hannah said pointedly, making sure the doctor understood that the baby's care had been a collaborative effort. He knows his son's needs better than anyone, and he's taught me things about infant care that I never learned from the women in town. Dr. Whitmore nodded politely, but Hannah could see that her words had not had the effect she intended. Instead of recognizing Nalnish's parental expertise, the doctor seemed to be cataloging information for some purpose that remained unclear after the examination was complete. Dr. Whitmore asked to speak with Hannah privately, and she reluctantly followed him onto the front porch, leaving Nalnish inside with his son. The conversation that followed would test every principle Hannah had discovered about herself in the weeks since she had opened her door to a desperate stranger. Mrs. Fletcher, Dr. Whitmore began, his tone carefully neutral. I've been asked by certain members of the community to assess the situation here and to provide guidance about the best course of action for all involved. Hannah felt her stomach tighten as she realized that this visit was not about medical care, but about the political implications of her choices. What kind of guidance? Hannah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Dr. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with a task he found distasteful but felt obligated to perform. There are concerns that your arrangement with this Indian man and his child could create problems for the entire valley. Some people are worried that you're being taken advantage of, that you might be in danger, or that your actions could encourage other Indians to expect similar treatment from white settlers. Hannah felt anger rising in her chest, but she also understood that Dr. Whitmore was not the source of these concerns, merely their messenger. And what do you think, Doctor? Hannah asked, her voice carrying a challenge that she made no effort to disguise. Do you think I'm being taken advantage of? Do you think I'm in danger? Dr. Whitmore met her gaze steadily, and Hannah could see the conflict between his professional obligations and his personal observations. Honestly, Mrs. Fletcher, I see no evidence that you're in any danger. The man seems devoted to his child and grateful for your help. But I also have to consider the broader implications of the situation. Hannah realized that she was facing not just individual prejudice but the weight of an entire system designed to keep the races separate. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed, and Hannah looked up to see a group of riders that made her blood run cold. Leading the group was Sheriff Marcus Kane, a man whose reputation for dealing harshly with Indians was well known throughout the territory. Behind him rode Jake Morrison and several other local ranchers, their faces grim with the kind of determination that suggested they had come to resolve the situation permanently. Hannah felt her heart racing as she realized that the morning's medical visit had been a prelude to something far more serious. Mrs. Fletcher, Sheriff Kane called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. I've received reports that you're harboring an Indian on your property. I'm going to need to speak with him and assess the situation. Hannah stepped forward, positioning herself between the sheriff and her front door, her body language making it clear that she would not allow him to enter without a fight. Nalnish Begay is my guest, she said firmly, and he's done nothing wrong. He brought his sick child to me for help, and I helped him. That's not a crime. Sheriff Kane's expression remained impassive, but Hannah could see the steel beneath his professional demeanor. Ma'am, with respect, you don't get to decide what is and isn't a crime. There are laws about harboring Indians, and there are concerns about the safety of this community. I'm going to need to speak with him, and depending on what I find, I may need to take him into custody. Hannah felt the world tilting around her as she realized that her worst fears were becoming reality. The man who had become like family to her, who had shared his culture and his love with her, was about to be torn away by a system that saw him as nothing more than a threat to be eliminated. On what charges? Hannah demanded, her voice rising with indignation. What law has he broken? What threat has he posed? Sheriff Kane's patience seemed to be wearing thin, and Hannah could see that he was not accustomed to being challenged, especially by a woman. Mrs. Fletcher, I don't need to explain the law to you. I need your cooperation in resolving this situation peacefully. Now I'm going to ask you to step aside and let me do my job. Hannah felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, understanding that her next decision would determine not just Nalnish's fate, but the kind of person she would be for the rest of her life. Before Hannah could respond, the front door opened and Nalnish appeared, carrying Yiska in his arms. He had obviously heard the conversation, and his face carried the resignation of someone who had faced this kind of situation before. I will come with you, he said quietly, his voice carrying dignity despite the circumstances. But I ask that you allow me to make arrangements for my son's care. He is too young to be separated from those who love him. Hannah felt tears spring to her eyes at the quiet courage he displayed, even as her heart broke at the thought of losing him. No, Hannah said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. Nalnish, you don't have to go anywhere. Sheriff Kane, this man has committed no crime. He's been living peacefully on my property, caring for his child and helping me with ranch work. He's not a threat to anyone. Sheriff Kane's expression hardened at her defiance, and Hannah realized that she had crossed a line from which there might be no return. Mrs. Fletcher, I'm going to ask you one more time to step aside. If you continue to interfere with my duties, I'll have to consider whether you're in violation of the law as well. The threat hung in the air like a sword, and Hannah understood that she was facing a choice that would define everything that followed. The tension was broken by an unexpected voice from the group of riders. Sheriff Kane, might I suggest a different approach? Dr. Whitmore had remounted his horse and positioned himself between the sheriff and Hannah's porch. I've just completed a medical examination of the child, and I can attest that he's receiving excellent care. Perhaps we could explore alternatives to arrest that would address the community's concerns while recognizing the humanitarian nature of Mrs. Fletcher's actions. Hannah felt a surge of gratitude toward the doctor, realizing that he was risking his own reputation to defend her choices. Sheriff Kane looked irritated by the interruption, but Hannah could see that he was also calculating the political implications of his actions. Dr. Whitmore was a respected member of the territorial government, and his opinion carried weight that even the sheriff could not ignore. What kind of alternatives? Kane asked, his tone suggesting skepticism, but also a willingness to consider options that might resolve the situation without violence. Hannah held her breath, realizing that the next few minutes would determine whether her unlikely family would survive intact. The child clearly needs continued care, Dr. Whitmore said, his voice carrying the authority of medical expertise. And Mr. Begay appears to be a devoted father who poses no threat to the community. Perhaps we could establish a formal arrangement that would allow them to remain here temporarily, with appropriate oversight and conditions. Hannah felt hope stirring in her chest, but she also understood that any official arrangement would come with restrictions and surveillance that could destroy the peaceful life they had built together. Jake Morrison, who had been silent during the exchange, finally spoke up with the practical concerns of a rancher who understood the realities of frontier life. What about the other Indians? If word gets out that we're allowing them to stay here, won't that encourage others to come looking for the same treatment? Hannah realized that this question went to the heart of the community's fears, the worry that compassion shown to one family could lead to demands from many others. The dying people are not warlike, Nalnish said quietly, his voice carrying the patience of someone who had explained this many times before. We seek only to live in peace and to raise our children according to our traditions. If you allow us to stay, we will cause no trouble. We will work hard, we will contribute to the community, and we will respect your laws and customs." Hannah was struck by the dignity with which he presented his case, even as she understood that his words would carry little weight with men who had already made up their minds about his people. Sheriff Kane appeared to be wrestling with competing pressures, caught between his duty to enforce the law and the practical recognition that the situation was more complex than he had initially assumed. Hannah could see him calculating the political costs of different actions, weighing the demands of the community against the potential consequences of forcibly separating a father from his child. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said finally, "I'm going to need some guarantees. If I allow this arrangement to continue, I need your word that you'll be responsible for his actions and that you'll report any problems immediately." Hannah felt the weight of the responsibility he was placing on her, but she also understood that this might be their only chance. "You have my word," Hannah said without hesitation, though she also understood the implications of what she was promising. By accepting responsibility for Nalnish's actions, she was putting her own freedom and reputation at risk. If anything went wrong, she would be held accountable not just for her own choices but for his as well. It was a burden that few people would willingly accept, but Hannah had discovered that love often required sacrifices that logic could not justify. The negotiation that followed was tense and complex, with Dr. Whitmore serving as an unofficial mediator between the sheriff's demands and Hannah's determination to protect her chosen family. The final agreement was a compromise that satisfied no one completely but offered a path forward that all parties could accept. Nalnish and Yiska would be allowed to remain at the Fletcher Ranch under Hannah's supervision, with regular visits from territorial officials to ensure compliance with the terms of the arrangement. As the group of riders finally departed, Hannah felt both relief and apprehension about what the future might hold. She had won a victory, but it was a fragile one that could be overturned at any moment if the community's fears proved stronger than their capacity for compassion. More importantly, she had learned something fundamental about herself and about the nature of family. Love, she realized, was not just about caring for someone in the easy moments, but about fighting for them when the world tried to tear them apart. That evening, as Hannah sat by the fire with Nalnish and Yiska, she reflected on the day's events and the choices that had brought them to this moment. The baby was sleeping peacefully in her arms, his small body warm and trusting against her chest. Nalnish sat across from her, his face reflecting the exhaustion and stress of a day that could have ended in separation and tragedy. But there was also something else in his expression, a depth of gratitude and respect that spoke of bonds forged in the crucible of shared danger. "You risked everything for us today," Nalnish said softly, his voice carrying wonder at the sacrifice she had made. "Your reputation, your safety, your standing in the community. Why would you do such a thing for people who are not your blood?" Hannah looked down at the sleeping child in her arms, feeling the rightness of his presence in her life, the way he had filled spaces in her heart that she had thought were permanently empty. "Because you are my family," Hannah said simply, the words carrying a truth that transcended biology and social conventions. "Not because of blood or law or tradition, but because we chose each other in a moment of desperate need, and we've built something beautiful from that choice. Yiska is my son in every way that matters, and you are." She paused, searching for words to describe a relationship that had no clear category in the world they inhabited. "You are my partner in raising him," she finished, realizing that this was the most accurate description of what they had become. "We're not husband and wife, we're not siblings, but we're family in the truest sense of the word. We're people who have committed to caring for each other and for this child, regardless of what the world might say about it." Nalnish nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting an understanding that went beyond words. The fire crackled in the comfortable silence that followed, and Hannah felt a sense of peace that she had not experienced since before the accident that claimed Thomas and Michael. She had found her way back to family, though it looked nothing like what she had expected. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of their resolve, and new opportunities to prove that love could transcend the boundaries that others insisted on drawing. But tonight, in the warm circle of firelight, they were simply a family, sharing the quiet contentment of being together outside. The Colorado wind howled through the mountains, carrying with it the promise of more storms to come. But inside the Fletcher ranch house, three people who had been brought together by desperation and held together by choice, prepared to face whatever challenges the future might bring. They had learned that the most important battles were not fought with weapons, but with the courage to love despite the cost. And they were ready to defend their chosen family against any force that might try to tear them apart. 5 years had passed since that bitter winter night when desperation had brought Nalnish Begay to Hannah Rose Fletcher's door, and the small ranch house that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with the laughter of a child who had grown strong in the soil of two worlds. Yiska, now 6 years old, moved through his days with the confidence of a boy who had never doubted his place in the world, switching effortlessly between English and Navajo, between the practical skills Hannah taught him and the ancient wisdom his father shared during their evening walks beneath the Colorado stars. But as the spring of 1887 painted the mountains in shades of green and gold, Hannah was about to discover that the most profound transformations often come not from the dramatic moments that define us, but from the quiet choices that accumulate over years to create something entirely new. The morning that would change everything began with an unexpected letter that arrived with the weekly mail delivery from Cedar Falls. Hannah recognized the official seal of the territorial government, and her heart clenched with the familiar fear that had never completely left her during the years of their fragile arrangement. She had grown accustomed to the periodic visits from officials who came to assess their situation, always polite, but always watching, always ready to find fault with the life they had built together. But this letter felt different, heavier with implications that she could not yet understand. "What is it, Mama Hannah?" Yiska asked, using the name he had given her when he first learned to speak, a perfect blend of respect and affection that captured the unique nature of their relationship. He was sitting at the kitchen table, carefully practicing his letters under Nalnish's patient guidance, his small tongue protruding slightly with concentration as he formed the curves and angles that would unlock the world of written language. Hannah felt the familiar warmth that filled her chest whenever she watched the two of them together, father and son bound by love and shared purpose. "I'm not sure yet, little one," Hannah replied, though her voice carried an uncertainty that made both Nalnish and Yiska look up from their lesson. Hannah had learned to read the subtle signs of her own emotions, and she could feel the tension building in her shoulders as she broke the wax seal and unfolded the official document. The words that greeted her were both wonderful and terrifying, offering possibilities she had never dared to imagine while threatening to destroy the careful balance they had maintained for so long. The letter was from Judge William Morrison, the territorial magistrate who had overseen the legal arrangements that allowed Nalnish to remain on her ranch. But this was not another routine check-in or administrative adjustment. Instead, Judge Morrison was writing to inform her that the territorial government was considering a new policy regarding the adoption of Native American children by white families, and Hannah's situation with Yiska had been cited as a successful model for how such arrangements might work in practice. "They want to make our arrangement official," Hannah said slowly, her voice carrying wonder and fear in equal measure. "Judge Morrison says that if we're willing to participate in a formal adoption process, Yiska could become my legal son, with all the rights and protections that would entail." The words hung in the air like a promise and a threat, offering security they had never known while potentially destroying the delicate cultural balance that had made their family possible. Nalnish set down his pen and looked at Hannah with eyes that held the weight of years spent walking between two worlds. "What would this mean for us?" he asked quietly, though Hannah could see that he already understood the implications. Making Yiska's adoption official would provide legal protection for the boy, but it would also mean acknowledging the authority of a system that had never recognized Nalnish's rights as a father or his people's right to exist according to their own traditions. "It would mean that no one could ever take him away from us," Hannah said, though she also understood the complexity of what she was proposing. It would mean that he would have the same legal status as any other child in the territory, with the right to inherit property, to attend school, to make his own choices about his future. But even as she spoke, Hannah could see the shadow that crossed Nalnish's face, the recognition that such security would come at a cost that might be too high to pay. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of their years. Together, as they grappled with questions that had no easy answers, Yiska, despite his young age, seemed to understand the gravity of the discussion, listening quietly as his father and the woman who had raised him explored the implications of making their family official in the eyes of the law. Hannah could see the boy's intelligence working to understand concepts that were complex even for adults, and she marveled at the maturity that had developed in him through exposure to the challenges of their unusual situation. "What do you want, Yiska?" Hannah asked finally, recognizing that the boy whose future they were discussing had a right to participate in the decision. "Do you want to be my son in the eyes of the law, or do you want to remain as you are, part of both worlds but fully belonging to neither?" The question was perhaps too complex for a 6-year-old, but Hannah had learned that Yiska possessed wisdom beyond his years. Shaped by the unique circumstances of his upbringing, Yiska looked from Hannah to his father, his young face serious with the weight of consideration. "I want to be your son, Mama Hannah," he said finally, his voice carrying the certainty of a child who had never doubted the love that surrounded him. "But I also want to be my father's son, and I want to be Dine. Can I be all of those things at once?" The simple profundity of his question cut to the heart of the matter, and Hannah felt tears spring to her eyes as she recognized the wisdom of a child who had learned to navigate complex realities that defeated many adults. The weeks that followed were filled with careful consideration and difficult conversations as they worked to understand what the formal adoption process would require. Judge Morrison visited the ranch personally, bringing with him a team of territorial officials who assessed their living situation, interviewed all 3 family members, and documented the remarkable success of their unconventional arrangement. Hannah was nervous about the scrutiny, but she was also proud of what they had accomplished together. "This is remarkable," Judge Morrison told Hannah privately as they walked through the ranch that had been transformed by years of shared labor and love. "I've seen many attempts at cross-cultural adoption, but none that have succeeded as completely as this one. The boy is clearly thriving. He's receiving an excellent education, and he's developing a strong sense of identity that honors both his heritage and his adoptive family." Hannah felt a surge of pride at the recognition, but she also understood that their success had come at a cost that not everyone would be willing to pay. The formal adoption hearing was held on a warm June morning in the territorial courthouse in Cedar Falls, with what seemed like half the town in attendance. Hannah had expected curiosity and perhaps some opposition, but she was surprised by the number of people who came to support their family. Mrs. Patterson, now in her 70s but still sharp as a tack, testified about the positive changes she had witnessed in Hannah since Yiska came into her life. Dr. Whitmore provided medical testimony about the boy's excellent health and development. Even Jake Morrison, who had initially opposed their arrangement, spoke about the valuable contributions Nalnish had made to the community through his work with struggling ranchers. But it was Yiska himself who provided the most compelling testimony, speaking with the clarity and confidence of a child who had been raised to understand his own worth and place in the world. "Mama Hannah saved my life when I was a baby," he told the judge, his small voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. She taught me to read and write and to take care of animals. Papa Nalnish taught me about our people and our traditions, and how to be strong and good. I want to be their son forever, in every way that matters." The simple honesty of his words seemed to move everyone in the room, and Hannah felt her heart swelling with pride and love. Judge Morrison's decision was swift and decisive. This court finds that the adoption of Yiska Bege by Hannah Rose Fletcher is in the best interests of the child and should be approved with full legal recognition, he announced, his voice carrying the authority of law and the warmth of personal conviction. Furthermore, this court recognizes Nalnish Bege as the child's father and grants him all the rights and responsibilities that such recognition entails. The ruling was groundbreaking, establishing legal precedent for the recognition of Native American parental rights within the territorial system. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Cedar Falls had ever seen, with members of the white community joining together with Nalnish's extended family, who had traveled from across the region to witness this historic moment. Hannah found herself surrounded by people who had once viewed her with suspicion, but now recognized her as a pioneer in a new kind of family structure that honored both tradition and progress. The barriers that had once seemed insurmountable had been lowered through years of patient work and genuine love, but perhaps the most significant transformation was yet to come. As Yiska grew older, he began to serve as a bridge between the white and Native American communities, using his unique position to foster understanding and cooperation that had previously seemed impossible. He became fluent in multiple languages, studied both traditional Navajo healing practices and modern medicine, and eventually established a school that welcomed children from all backgrounds. Hannah said to Nalnish one evening as they watched their son, now a young man of 21, addressing a gathering of territorial officials about the need for better relations between different communities, "I think we did something important here. Not just for us, but for everyone who comes after." Nalnish nodded, his hair now streaked with silver, but his eyes still bright with the wisdom and kindness that had first captured Hannah's heart. "The Creator works in mysterious ways," he replied, using the English phrase he had learned from Hannah while maintaining the spiritual perspective that had always guided his understanding of the world. "He brought us together in a moment of desperate need, and from that desperation, we created something beautiful. Love has no boundaries. When it is true, and family is not defined by blood, but by the choices we make every day." Hannah felt the truth of his words settling into her bones, understanding that they had discovered something precious and rare. The years that followed brought many changes to the Fletcher Ranch and to the community of Cedar Falls. Yiska married a young woman from the neighboring settlement, a teacher who shared his passion for education and cultural understanding. They raised their own children on the ranch, creating a third generation that carried forward the lessons of acceptance and love that had been forged in the crucible of unlikely circumstances. Hannah lived to see her great-grandchildren playing in the same fields where she had once walked alone, grieving for the family she had lost. Nalnish remained on the ranch until his death at the age of 73, passing peacefully in his sleep surrounded by the family he had helped to create. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people from across the territory, representing every background and culture that had been touched by his gentle wisdom and unwavering commitment to peace. Hannah spoke at the service, her voice strong despite her grief, telling the story of how a desperate father's love had transformed not just her life but the entire community. "He taught us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act with love despite that fear," Hannah said, her words carrying across the assembled crowd like a benediction. "He showed us that family is not about blood or law or tradition, but about the daily choice to care for each other with patience and devotion. And he proved that the bridges between different worlds are built not with grand gestures, but with small acts of kindness, repeated over and over until they become stronger than the walls that once divided us." The service concluded with prayers in both English and Navajo, a fitting tribute to a man who had lived his life as a bridge between worlds. Hannah herself lived to the remarkable age of 87, remaining active on the ranch and in the community until just weeks before her death. She had become something of a legend throughout the territory, known not just for her successful adoption of a Navajo child, but for her pioneering work in cross-cultural understanding and cooperation. Scholars came from universities back east to study her methods, and government officials sought her advice on policy matters affecting Native American communities. But Hannah's greatest legacy was not her public achievements, but the private transformation she had undergone through the simple act of opening her door to a stranger in need. She had learned that love was not a finite resource to be hoarded, but an infinite wellspring that grew stronger with sharing. She had discovered that family was not something you were born into, but something you created through daily choices and sustained commitment. And she had proven that the most profound changes often began with the smallest acts of compassion. The ranch itself became a symbol of what was possible when people chose love over fear, understanding over prejudice, and cooperation over conflict. Visitors came from across the country to see the place where a white widow and a Navajo father had raised a child who grew up to become a leader in both communities. The story of Hannah Rose Fletcher and Nalnish Begay became legend, passed down through generations as proof that the human heart knows no boundaries when it is open to the possibility of love. In the family cemetery behind the ranch house, beneath the same towering pines that had provided shade for 3 generations of the Fletcher Begay family, 3 headstones stand as testament to the power of chosen love. The first reads Hannah Rose Fletcher, 1850 to 1937, beloved mother and pioneer of the heart. The second bears the inscription, Nalnish Begay, 1852 to 1925, father, teacher, bridge builder. And the third, placed there many years later, simply says, Yuska Fletcher Begay, 1882 to 1964, son of 2 worlds, father of many. Together, they represent not just the end of 3 remarkable lives, but the beginning of a legacy that continues to inspire those who believe that love can triumph over any obstacle. The story of how a desperate Navajo brave's plea for help became the foundation of a family that transcended every boundary society tried to impose reminds us that the most important revolutions happen not in the halls of power, but in the quiet moments when ordinary people choose to see the humanity in those who seem different from themselves. Hannah Rose Fletcher opened her door to a stranger and discovered that she had been waiting her whole life for the family that would walk through it. And in doing so, she proved that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the most difficult challenges, and that love, when it is true, has the power to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. The letter arrived on a crisp October morning in 1952, addressed to the Historical Society of Colorado in the careful handwriting of someone who had learned to write in an era when penmanship was considered a mark of character. Mrs. Eleanor Fletcher Begay Williams, great-granddaughter of Hannah Rose Fletcher and Yiska Fletcher Begay, was donating her family's entire collection of letters, photographs, and documents to ensure that their remarkable story would never be forgotten. The historian assigned to catalog the collection was Dr. Margaret Sandoval, a young professor of Western American Studies who had recently completed her doctorate with a dissertation on cross-cultural family structures in the territorial period. She had heard whispers of the Fletcher Begay story during her research, but nothing had prepared her for the wealth of first-hand accounts and photographic evidence that revealed the full scope of what had transpired. The first box contained Hannah's journals, written in the flowing script of a woman who had learned to read and write in the formal style of the mid-19th century. The earliest entries dated from just after Thomas and Michael's deaths, filled with the raw grief of a woman who had lost everything she thought to find her identity. But as Dr. Sandoval read through the months and years that followed, she witnessed A transformation that was both deeply personal and historically significant. January 15, 1883. One entry read, Yuska took his first steps today, walking from Nalnish's arms to mine across the kitchen floor. The joy on his father's face was matched only by the pride in my own heart. I find myself wondering if my own Michael would have walked with such determination, and I realize that I can hold both grief for the child I lost and love for the child I found without diminishing either feeling. Perhaps this is what healing looks like, not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of hope strong enough to carry us forward. The journals revealed layers of complexity that had been lost in the simplified versions of the story that had been passed down through oral tradition. Hannah wrote extensively about the challenges of navigating cultural differences, the delicate balance required to honor Nalnish's Navajo heritage while preparing Yiska for life in a predominantly white society. She documented the gradual acceptance of their family by the Cedar Falls community, noting the individual transformations that occurred as people moved from suspicion to understanding. The second box contained Nalnish's own writings, though these were fewer and more sporadic, written in the careful English of someone who had learned the language as an adult. His entries provided a perspective on their family story that was both profound and heartbreaking, offering insights into the experience of a man who had watched his entire way of life disappear, while struggling to preserve its essence for his son. The white woman's God and the creator of my people are perhaps the same being, speaking different languages but teaching the same lessons about love and sacrifice. Nalnish had written in 1885, Hannah Rose has shown me that kindness has no color, that courage has no nationality, and that family is not about blood, but about the willingness to choose each other every day. My son will grow up knowing that he belongs to both worlds, and perhaps that knowledge will help him build bridges that my generation could not imagine. The third box contained correspondence between Hannah and various territorial officials, documenting the legal and political challenges they had faced in establishing their family. These letters revealed the extent to which their case had influenced policy discussions about Native American rights and cross-cultural adoption. Judge Morrison's files showed that the Fletcher Begay case had been cited in numerous subsequent legal decisions, establishing precedents that protected other mixed families throughout the territory. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery was a series of letters between Hannah and Yiska himself, written during his years at the Colorado School of Mines, where he had studied engineering while also developing his skills as a mediator between different cultural communities. These letters revealed the deep intellectual and emotional bond that had developed between the woman who had raised him and the young man who had become her greatest achievement. My dearest Mama Hannah, Yiska had written in 1901, I have been thinking about the conversation we had last Christmas, when you asked me whether I ever regretted the unusual circumstances of my upbringing. I want you to know that I consider myself the luckiest man alive, not because my life has been easy, but because it has been meaningful. You and Papa Nalnish taught me that identity is not about choosing between different parts of yourself, but about finding the strength to embrace all of who you are. The fourth box contained photographs, and these proved to be the most emotionally powerful part of the collection. There were formal portraits of Hannah, Nalnish, and Yiska taken in the photographic studio in Cedar Falls, showing a family that appeared conventional despite the extraordinary circumstances of their formation. But it was the candid photographs taken on the ranch that truly captured the essence of their relationship. One photograph showed Hannah and Nalnish working together to deliver a calf, their faces focused and determined as they collaborated to bring new life into the world. Another captured Yiska as a young boy, sitting between his two parents on the front porch of the ranch house, his arms around both of them in a gesture of natural affection that spoke volumes about the love that had sustained their family. The photograph that moved Dr. Sandoval to tears showed Hannah in her final years, surrounded by her great-grandchildren, her face lined with age, but her eyes still bright with the intelligence and compassion that had defined her life. She was holding a baby, and the tenderness in her expression was identical to the way she had looked at Yiska in the earliest photographs. The caption read, "Great-grandmother Hannah with baby Thomas, 1936. She always said that every child was a gift from the Creator, regardless of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth." The fifth box contained documents related to the transformation of the Fletcher Ranch into a school and community center that had operated until the 1940s. Yiska had established the Fletcher Begay Institute as a memorial to his parents, creating a place where children from all backgrounds could receive education that honored both academic achievement and cultural diversity. The institute had become a model for similar programs throughout the West. Dr. Sandoval spent months studying the materials, and as she worked, she began to understand that she was not just cataloging historical documents, but preserving the record of a social experiment that had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest imagination. The Fletcher Begay family had proven that love could transcend racial boundaries, that understanding could overcome prejudice, and that individual choices could create lasting change in entire communities. The impact of their story had extended far beyond their immediate family and community. Dr. Sandoval discovered references to the Fletcher Begay case in legal documents from across the country, evidence that their precedent-setting adoption had influenced similar cases in other territories and states. Scholars and social reformers had visited the ranch to study their methods, and several had written about their experiences in academic journals and popular magazines. One particularly significant discovery was a letter from Mary Austin, the famous author and social reformer, who had visited the ranch in 1895 and had been deeply moved by what she witnessed. "I have seen the future," Austin had written to a colleague, "and it is not the future that politicians and generals imagine, with their talk of conquest and domination. It is the future that Hannah Fletcher and Nalish Begay have created in their small corner of Colorado, a future where love is stronger than fear, where understanding is more powerful than prejudice, and where family is defined not by blood, but by the courage to choose each other every day." The collection also revealed the extent to which the Fletcher Begay story had influenced the early development of social work and child welfare policies in the American West. Hannah's detailed records of Yiska's development had been studied by researchers interested in the effects of cross-cultural adoption, and her methods had been adapted by social workers throughout the region. The final discovery was a letter that Hannah had written to Yiska on the occasion of his graduation from the Colorado School of Mines. The letter had never been sent, but Eleanor had found it among her great-grandmother's papers and had included it in the collection as a testament to the depth of love that had sustained their family. "My dearest son," the letter began, "as I write these words, I am thinking back to that terrible winter night when your father first brought you to my door. You were dying, and I was dying too, though in a different way. We saved each other, you and I, and in doing so, we discovered that the most important families are not the ones we are born into, but the ones we create through daily choices and sustained commitment." The letter concluded with words that captured the essence of what their family had accomplished. "You have become a bridge between worlds, a living proof that love knows no boundaries and that understanding can overcome any obstacle. Your father and I did not give you an easy life, but we gave you a meaningful one, and I pray that you will carry forward the lessons we have shared, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act with love despite that fear, and that the greatest legacy we can leave is not wealth or fame, but the knowledge that we made the world a little more compassionate than we found it." Dr. Sandoval completed her catalog of the Fletcher Begay collection in the spring of 1953, and her findings were published in a comprehensive report that brought national attention to the family story. The report was featured in newspapers across the country, and it sparked renewed interest in the history of cross-cultural families in the American West, the Fletcher Ranch House was restored to its 1880s appearance and opened to the public as a museum where visitors could learn about the family that had proven that the American dream was large enough to include people of all backgrounds. The museum's most popular exhibit was a recreation of the kitchen where Hannah had first fed baby Yiska, complete with the rocking chair where she had spent countless hours nurturing a child who was not her own by birth, but who had become her son in every way that mattered. In the years that followed, the Fletcher Begay story became a touchstone for the civil rights movement, cited by activists and scholars as evidence that integration was not only possible but beneficial for all involved. The family's success provided a historical precedent for arguments about the importance of cultural diversity and the strength that came from communities that embraced difference rather than fearing it. The museum's guest book filled with entries from visitors who had been moved by the family's story and inspired by their example. "Thank you for showing us that love is stronger than prejudice," wrote one visitor from Alabama in 1963. "Your family's story gives me hope that my own children will grow up in a world where they are judged by their character rather than their color." The Fletcher Begay story had become more than just a historical curiosity. It had become a legend that inspired people to believe in the possibility of change and the power of individual action to create lasting transformation. The family that had begun with a desperate father's plea for help had become a symbol of hope for anyone who believed that love could overcome the barriers that others insisted were insurmountable. As Dr. Sandoval reflected on her work with the collection, she realized that she had been privileged to witness something extraordinary. The documentation of how ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things through the simple act of choosing love over fear. The Fletcher Begay family had not set out to change the world. They had simply tried to care for each other in the face of difficult circumstances. The story of Hannah Rose Fletcher, Nalnish Begay, and Yiska Fletcher Begay reminds us that the barriers between different communities are not natural or inevitable but constructed and maintained by people who choose fear over understanding. Their family proved that those barriers could be dismantled by individuals who were willing to see the humanity in those who seemed different from themselves. In the end, the Fletcher Begay legacy lives on not just in the museum that bears their name or in the historical records that document their achievements, but in the countless families who have been inspired by their example to create their own bridges between different worlds. They showed us that love is not diminished when it is shared across racial or cultural boundaries, but strengthened. Their story echoes through time as a reminder that, in a world often divided by fear and misunderstanding, the choice to love courageously and unconditionally can create ripples that extend far beyond our ability to measure or control. Hannah Rose Fletcher opened her door to a desperate stranger and discovered that she had been waiting her whole life for the family that would transform not just her own existence, but the entire community around her.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.